The night sky over Doha should have been quiet, just the desert winds carrying the voices of families preparing for morning prayer. But at 3:47 a.m., the silence was ripped apart. Israeli F-35 jets roared across the Qatari capital and unleashed precision strikes without warning, without provocation, and without justification. The images that followed plumes of smoke rising over a sleeping city, families running through the streets in terror, were broadcast across the Arab world. And when those images reached Africa, they struck a chord deeper than politics. For Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, those flames over Doha looked like the flames that once consumed Ouagadougou. "My brothers and sisters," he declared when Israel struck Qatar, "I picked up the phone and called Netanyahu directly." That one sentence set the stage for something the world did not anticipate: Africa refusing silence. Where Washington hesitated with carefully chosen words, and where Europe muttered about diplomatic restraint, Traoré moved swiftly, condemning cutting ties and turning what was supposed to be Israel's display of power into a global lesson about sovereignty. And this is where the story truly matters for us. Because it wasn't only about Qatar, it was about whether smaller nations still have a right to dignity in a world ruled by superpowers. It was about Africa proving that the global south is no longer a silent observer, but a force capable of shifting history. So I ask you, was this the moment Africa took its place as a defender of sovereignty worldwide? Or will the pressures of Washington and Tel Aviv eventually silence this new voice of independence? Please share this video if you believe that standing up for truth matters more than headlines. And subscribe if you want to be among the first to hear how President Ibrahim Traoré and Africa are reshaping the future no one thought possible. At exactly 3:47 a.m. in Doha, the world changed. Israeli F-35 jets cut through Qatari airspace, delivering precision strikes that no one had anticipated. The excuse from Tel Aviv came swiftly: counterterrorism, preemptive defense. Words we've heard before, words that powerful nations always use when they want to disguise aggression as security, but there was no imminent threat, no warning, no provocation. What Israel had done was not defense. It was the naked violation of a sovereign nation. Qatar, unlike Gaza, is not under occupation. It is a recognized state with embassies around the world protected under international law and with the right to live without fear of foreign bombardment. And yet in that single strike, Netanyahu had crossed a line that rippled far beyond the Gulf. For many across Africa, the smoke over Doha looked painfully familiar, like the smoke that has often risen over their own cities under foreign interference. From Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré did not wait for analysts or allies. He did not hide behind vague statements. Within minutes of the news reaching him, he picked up his phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. "Your aircraft crossed a line," he told the Israeli Prime Minister. "Africa will not stay silent." That direct confrontation, so rare in global diplomacy, was more than words. It was the opening shot in what would become a storm of African resistance. By 4 a.m., Traoré convened his cabinet in the presidential palace. His order was uncompromising: prepare the strongest possible condemnation. Where Washington offered concern and where Brussels whispered about restraint, Burkina Faso issued consequences. Within hours, a statement went public. Burkina Faso was suspending all military cooperation with Israel. Training programs were canceled, defense contracts were terminated, intelligence sharing agreements were ripped up. For a country like Burkina Faso, dependent on every ounce of security and partnership, this was not symbolic. It was costly, deliberate, and bold. The reaction from Tel Aviv was immediate. Within 2 hours, the Israeli ambassador placed an urgent call to the Burkina Faso presidency, pleading for clarification. His words: "Mr. President, this is a misunderstanding." Traoré's reply was cutting. "The only misunderstanding is Netanyahu thinking Africa won't defend sovereignty." That single sentence captured what many across the continent had felt for decades: that their dignity and sovereignty were treated as optional, as bargaining chips in global games of power. As dawn broke over Africa, the news spread quickly. Within 6 hours of Burkina Faso's announcement, the Israeli ambassador had requested emergency meetings in multiple capitals. By 12 hours, Netanyahu's own office was contacting the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, hoping to cool tempers. And within 24 hours, international defense contractors were already calculating the billions at risk if African partnerships collapsed. But for Ibrahim Traoré, this was never just about contracts or diplomatic formulas. It was about principle. It was about showing that the global south could draw a line and enforce it. And this time, that principle was not whispered, it was shouted. In his televised address, Traoré spoke not only to his people, but to the continent. No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence, he declared from the palace steps. The language was blunt, stripped of diplomatic niceties, and it resonated deeply across borders. Africans in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, people who had long felt sidelined by the decisions of distant superpowers, saw in his voice something different, the possibility that Africa could finally stand tall on the world stage. The sequence of events was breathtaking in its speed. Within the first 24 hours, 15 African leaders issued similar condemnations. By 48 hours, the African Union was holding emergency sessions to coordinate their stance. By 72 hours, ambassadors were being recalled from Tel Aviv, and countries like South Africa and Algeria were suspending ties. What began as a midnight strike over Doha had turned into a continental awakening, and at the center of it all was a young captain from Burkina Faso who refused to accept silence as the only option. For Traoré, the attack on Qatar was personal. When I saw smoke over Doha's skyline, he said, I saw Ouagadougou. It was a reminder that the line between Africa and the Middle East, between their struggles and their sovereignty, is thinner than the world realizes. This was the stage set for the storm to come, a clash not just between Israel and Qatar, but between a system of impunity and a continent tired of being ignored. The turning point came not with words, but with actions. Within hours of Burkina Faso's announcement, Israel felt the ground shifting beneath its feet. Defense officials in Tel Aviv, who once dismissed African states as marginal players, suddenly found themselves facing the collapse of lucrative contracts and decades of quiet partnerships. For the first time in modern history, an African president had placed Israel in check, and the ripple effects spread like wildfire. The Israeli ambassador in Ouagadougou called again, his tone more desperate this time. Mr. President, we can clarify this situation, he pleaded, but Traoré refused to soften. Clarify it to the families running from bombs in Doha, he replied. That exchange, leaked within hours, captured headlines across Africa. To ordinary citizens, it wasn't just diplomacy, it was dignity finally defended. By midday, the dominoes began to fall. Ghana's president received a personal call from Netanyahu himself. He listened for less than a minute before hanging up. Nigeria's leader refused the call altogether. In Kenya, the line went dead after 30 seconds. These symbolic acts may have seemed small to Western observers, but for Africans, they were monumental. Leaders who once bowed under pressure were standing firm. The African Union's emergency session convened faster than anyone in Tel Aviv or Washington expected. In Addis Ababa, representatives from across the continent gathered under one banner: sovereignty must be defended. The debate was fierce, but the outcome was unanimous collective condemnation. Within 48 hours, statements poured out: South Africa suspending diplomatic relations, Algeria closing its airspace to Israeli flights, Morocco canceling agricultural agreements, Nigeria terminating defense contracts. Suddenly, Israel was not just facing Qatar, it was facing Africa. Television analysts in Jerusalem admitted on live broadcasts, "This is unprecedented. We have never seen coordinated African retaliation of this scale." The words rattled Netanyahu's inner circle. His office scrambled to contact Washington, urging American pressure on African capitals. But every call, every veiled threat, every promise of aid came too late. The tide had already turned. For ordinary Africans, the moment was electric. On radio shows in Lagos, callers cheered that their leaders had finally spoken with one voice. In markets in Bamako and Dakar, people whispered that this was what true independence looked like, not just flags and anthems, but real resistance to foreign domination. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered outside the presidential palace chanting Traoré's name, waving both Burkinabe and Qatari flags. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's government scrambled to contain the fallout. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant personally boarded a plane attempting shuttle diplomacy across 3 African capitals. But the doors were closed. Presidents refused meetings. Foreign ministers declined appointments. In one airport, Gallant's diplomatic privileges were even restricted, a humiliation unthinkable only days before. He told African media, "We never intended to harm relations with Africa." But by then, intentions no longer mattered. Actions did. The climax came when within 72 hours, 15 African nations had formally recalled their ambassadors from Tel Aviv. Images of empty embassies circulated online while Israeli companies reported billions in cancelled contracts. Netanyahu, in a closed-door meeting later leaked to the press, confessed, "We underestimated Africa. We treated them like irrelevant observers instead of sovereign equals." It was an admission of failure that echoed far beyond Israel's borders. And the world was watching. Arab leaders, emboldened by Africa's unity, hardened their own stances. Turkey and Iran praised the African example of courage. In Latin America, leaders issued their own condemnations, citing Africa's leadership as inspiration. Even in Asia, where many nations had remained silent, there was a quiet shift, an acknowledgement that a new diplomatic power was emerging. For Israel, what was supposed to be a display of military strength had become a diplomatic nightmare. For Africa, what began as one president's phone call had transformed into a continental uprising. And for the world, it was a glimpse of something few had dared to imagine: Africa no longer a silent witness, but an active, united force capable of reshaping global politics. The climax of this story was not just about retaliation. It was about identity. It was about nations that had long been dismissed as weak, proving that unity could make them strong. And in that unity, Netanyahu discovered what superpowers fear most: not missiles or tanks, but a continent's collective refusal to be ignored. The dust of the immediate crisis settled, but the consequences that followed cut deeper than any single airstrike. For Israel, the cost of underestimating Africa was staggering. For Africa, the reward of unity was unprecedented. And for ordinary civilians, both in Qatar and across the African continent, the ripple effects of this confrontation touched daily life in ways that could not be ignored. Economically, Israel faced an avalanche of losses. Within 1 week, defense contractors reported billions in canceled contracts. Long-standing agricultural deals with North and West African states evaporated overnight. Mining companies with access to Africa's strategic minerals, cobalt, manganese, uranium, found their supply chains disrupted. For Tel Aviv, Africa had always been a resource base, a place to secure leverage in global markets. Now that door was slamming shut. Investors began to panic, questioning whether Israel's political leadership had gambled away decades of carefully built influence. Diplomatically, the isolation was even more humiliating. 15 ambassadors recalled from Tel Aviv left gaping voids in Israel's African relations. Embassies closed, consulates went dark, and diplomatic staff flew home on emergency orders. In Addis Ababa, the African Union passed a resolution declaring Israel's actions against Qatar a violation of international law. This was not symbolic theater, it was binding, a public rebuke that carried real weight in the United Nations. Suddenly, Israel could no longer count on Africa's 54 votes in global forums, votes that had often shielded it from deeper scrutiny. But beyond governments and contracts, there was the human side of the story. In Qatar, families who had fled their homes in terror found themselves supported by African solidarity. Relief funds raised quickly in Burkina Faso and Mali were sent to Doha as a gesture of friendship. Qatari leaders responded by reminding the world that their nation had invested in African hospitals, schools, and infrastructure long before this crisis. The bond of reciprocity. "They stood with us, we stand with them," became a living example of what genuine partnership means. In Burkina Faso itself, the political consequences were profound. Traoré's decision to act swiftly at great risk elevated him to a status few African leaders had reached in decades. Crowds poured into Ouagadougou's streets to celebrate not only their president, but also their own dignity as a people. For ordinary Burkinabe, this was more than geopolitics. It was proof that their small nation could influence the world. Farmers, students, and workers spoke on local radio. "We saw the bombs over Doha, and we felt they were meant for us too. Now, for the first time, we feel protected." The crisis also reshaped the political atmosphere across the continent. Opposition parties that often accused ruling governments of weakness now found themselves echoing the call for sovereignty. From Lagos to Nairobi, leaders discovered that supporting Traoré's stance was not only morally right, but politically popular. Citizens wanted more than words, they wanted boldness. And those who failed to join the chorus faced growing criticism at home. Meanwhile, Israel's attempts at damage control fell flat. Emergency aid packages, diplomatic tours, promises of renewed friendship, all were rejected. The narrative had shifted, and no amount of money could buy back trust. The message was clear: you cannot strike a sovereign capital on Monday and expect friendship on Tuesday. The civil and political aftermath of the Qatar strike showed the world two truths. First, that Israel had suffered one of its greatest diplomatic miscalculations in modern times. And second, that Africa, once treated as a passive bystander, had proven itself a decisive player in international affairs. For Africans, this was more than a reaction to a foreign war. It was a declaration of agency, a collective assertion that their continent would no longer remain silent when sovereignty anywhere in the world was threatened. If the strikes on Qatar sent shockwaves through the Gulf and Africa's unified response rattled Israel, the reaction in Washington revealed another layer of the story. For decades, American officials assumed Africa's loyalty could be secured through aid packages, military training, and occasional photo op summits. But now they faced a continent refusing to bend, and the State Department scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Within hours of Burkina Faso's condemnation, U.S. diplomats called African capitals with a familiar warning that strong reactions risked destabilizing regional security. In private, CIA liaisons urged presidents to moderate their tone, hinting at economic reprisals. Yet the irony was too glaring to ignore. Washington accused Africa of destabilization, while defending the nation that had launched unprovoked strikes on Doha. To many African leaders, it felt like the old colonial script playing again, the powerful justifying their allies while silencing dissent from the global South. But this time, the script no longer worked. American pressure only hardened African resolve. Presidents who might once have hesitated found strength in the collective stand. As one West African minister remarked to local media, "When the hegemon defends the violator, the victims must stand together." The phrase spread across social media, symbolizing a shift in perception, not only of Israel, but of America itself. Globally, Africa's defiance ignited a chorus of support. In the Middle East, Arab League leaders praised Burkina Faso's swift action. Iran's foreign minister declared Africa shows the world how sovereignty should be defended. Turkey's president went further, saying that Africa's voice had redefined the balance of power. For years, the Middle East had looked to Western capitals for solidarity. Now it was looking southward. In Latin America, where memories of U.S. interventions remain vivid, leaders drew direct parallels. "If Africa can resist, so can we," one Brazilian commentator said on national television. From Caracas to Buenos Aires, editorials hailed Africa's boldness as proof that smaller nations could reshape global politics. In Asia, too, governments that had initially stayed silent began reconsidering their positions. Quietly, analysts in Beijing and New Delhi noted that Africa's diplomatic unity had created a precedent that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, American media outlets struggled with how to frame the story. Some downplayed Africa's actions as symbolic. Others admitted with rare candor that the United States had underestimated Africa's capacity to act as a bloc. What unsettled Washington most was not just the diplomatic fallout, but the possibility of losing Africa's strategic resources and voting bloc at the United Nations. Losing those 54 voices would cripple American influence in the very institutions it once dominated. For Israel, the consequences of Africa's retaliation were devastating. But for the United States, the implications were more profound. If Africa could unite against Tel Aviv, could it also resist Washington's pressure in the future? Could this be the beginning of a global South alignment that challenges not only Israel's actions, but America's broader dominance? The Qatar strike, intended to showcase military strength, had instead exposed the fragility of old alliances. Across the world, leaders were forced to recalculate. In Africa's defiance, they saw not just outrage, but a vision of a new order where sovereignty is defended by collective will, not dictated by superpowers. For an older American audience watching this unfold, the lesson is stark. The age of one-sided dominance is ending. Africa's voice, long ignored, is now shaping decisions in Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, and beyond. And if this moment marks the start of a new global balance, it is a balance where Africa finally sits at the table not as a guest, but as a power in its own right. The night Israel struck Qatar will not be remembered for the roar of F-35 jets. It will be remembered for the roar of Africa's response. A continent long treated as silent background suddenly stood center stage, declaring that sovereignty is not a privilege, but a right. And in that declaration, Africa forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The days of impunity are ending. For Israel, the cost was immediate. Contracts canceled, airspace closed, embassies emptied. For America, the cost was reputational, seen once again defending the violator while lecturing the victims. But for Africa, the reward was dignity. For once, 54 nations spoke with one voice, and that voice was too loud to ignore. Yet let us not imagine this as the end of the struggle. Powerful nations rarely accept limits quietly. Already we see Washington lobbying Tel Aviv, maneuvering, and European capitals whispering about how to reassert control. Africa's defiance is inspiring, but it also invites pressure, sabotage, and the old tactics of divide and conquer. The next battle will not only be about Qatar, or even about Israel. It will be about whether Africa can hold this unity when the bribes, threats, and promises come knocking. This is why the moment matters for us all, because it sets a precedent. If Africa can force accountability for strikes on Qatar, then tomorrow it can do the same for interventions in Sudan, or sanctions on Zimbabwe, or foreign interference in Burkina Faso. If sovereignty matters for Doha, it must also matter for Ouagadougou, for Bamako, for Kinshasa. This is the principle that transforms outrage into order. But here lies the warning: unity is fragile. Without vigilance, it can fracture. Without courage, it can collapse. And without truth, it can be co-opted. If Africa fails to defend this stand, then Netanyahu's gamble will not just harm Qatar, it will prove that even the boldest resistance can be silenced. So let me ask you directly, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's stand for Qatar proves that Africa is ready to reshape global politics? Or do you fear that America and Israel will find ways to fracture this unity before it becomes permanent? Please share this video if you feel proud that Africa finally stood tall for sovereignty. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, and leave your thoughts in the comments because the conversation does not end here. The world may be watching leaders, but history is written by the voices of people who refuse silence. Tomorrow another test will come, another capital may face threats. And when it does, the question will remain, will Africa's voice still rise together, or will it be drowned out by the old chorus of domination? The answer will shape not only Africa's destiny, but the balance of the entire world.